My second fundamental principle of movement is gait. Now, as I mentioned, respiration and gait are my number 1 and 2, not in any order in particular, but what gait does provide us with is an understanding of what happens at the body at different joints at different times. Now, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll study anatomy. They'll look at how the heel moves, they'll look at how the big toe moves, maybe they'll look at how the hip internally rotates, etc. What they do is they don't provide or they don't apply it to a functional representation, something like gait. Because when I go through the 3 different phases of gait, heel strike, mid stance, and toe offs, although I would divide, and we will be dividing mid stance into 2 different phases, early mid stance and late mid stance, because it is the longest part of gait and they have different effects on the hip. By applying joint ranges of motion, joint movement, muscle tension, eccentric and concentric orientation of the tissues, yielding and overcoming of the tendons, what that is going to do is that's going to provide us with a functional model of how we can apply anatomy, not just memorizing origins and insertions and attachment points, but it's going to provide us with understanding of how these things integrate in a more dynamic way. Because when we're looking at somebody doing a lunge, for example, what we're doing is we're looking at how our anatomy works in dynamic ways, how it manages forces, how we can have certain tissues that are more eccentric while other tissues are more concentric, how the pressures within our body can be manipulated. And so gait is just a forward progression of our body or a forward progression of our center of mass. And as I said, we are going to be dividing gait or our assessments and our exercise selection based on these phases of gait, because each phase has different representation of what's going to be happening at the joints above. So we've got heel strike, early mid stance, late mid stance, and toe off. Heel strike, we're looking at more range of motion, the most amount of range of motion, because as our foot strikes the ground, we need to be able to move into a space, because if we just have muscle tension, then we're not going to be able to absorb the force from the ground. We're not going to be able to have as much range of motion to be able to push or shoot our center of gravity forward. So it's going to be more external rotation and internal rotation. If someone were to ask me what is the best phase of gait for somebody who has a neutral posture, even though there isn't, but has access to all ranges of motion, I'd probably have to say it's in between heel strike and mid stance. Not at heel strike by itself and not at mid stance, but that transition zone right in between. Because now I'm going to have a decent amount of internal rotation, a decent amount of external rotation. I'm going to be able to get deep into a squat. I'm going to be able to touch my toes. So I'm going to be able to do all of these things while managing forces. And so when we get into mid stance, that is more of an internal rotation bias. So my foot is going to pronate, my tibia is going to internally rotate, my hip is going to internally rotate, and so will my innominate. My innominate will begin to internally rotate. And when I go through gait, so if this right hip here is heel strike, where the sacrum is turning towards the right side, as I get into mid stance, it's more of a transition zone, because this left leg is going to be swinging in the air, but we hit a certain point where the foot on the ground, where the foot directly underneath me into a hip extension, is internally rotating. So the innominate internally rotates, and the swing leg hits its maximal swing. That is also an internally rotated position. We now have this pelvis that is facing forward. We have the sacrum facing forward, not turning to one side, but facing directly forward. That allows us to put force into the ground to be able to propel ourselves forward. Then, as I go into toe off on this right side, where now this hip is extending, I'm going onto my toes. Now the sacrum is going to be turning towards the left foot that is about to go into heel strike and strike the ground. And so each of these phases of gait are going to be applied based on exercise selection, because they will also provide us with an understanding of where our center of mass is. With heel strike having our center of mass behind us, mid stance with our center of mass directly over top, and toe off with our center of mass progressing towards our toes. That allows us to propel forward. Each of these phases of gait will also have different force elements to it. So heel strike, if I break it down to a squat, for example, heel strike would be at the very bottom of the squat because, again, I have maximal range of motion. Mid stance is that sticking point or that in-between point. That's 60 to 120 degrees of hip flexion. And toe off is when I'm coming up to the top. So that's 60 to 0, where I'm getting that maximal hip extension and I'm really pushing the bar, pushing the load up. I'm standing straight up. So we can modify a squat based on what we are trying to achieve with these phases of gait. We will be talking a lot about that in week 3. We're talking about gait, foot position, and just lower limb anatomy and how we can assess the foot to be able to determine what is happening at the rib cage, at the pelvis, and how we are managing center of gravity. So gait is going to be a major part of this mentorship, and I personally believe it's going to be a major part in how you view movement.